we first started with just photographs submitted by Vietnam veterans, and some of those photographs were just simply so good that we knew we had to include them in this exhibit. And one of those was submitted by Margaret Gillespie of herself and her husband in a helicopter there in Vietnam. He was a Marine, she was an Army nurse, so they couldn't be stationed at the same posting there in Vietnam, but they were in the country at the same time. And just her expression on her face to be seated there in the helicopter, I think, was just captivating enough and neat enough that we knew that we had to include it. And everybody that visits the display sees that expression, that photograph. They're like, "Wow, check that out. That's really cool." This exhibit began with a very simple idea, and that is that the Vietnam veteran has always had a bit of I believe, a past that's been overshadowed in a lot of ways by the Greatest Generation and also by more recent events in Iraq and Afghanistan the past 20 years that received a lot of media attention during and since. And that Vietnam veteran kind of fell in between and did not get, certainly didn't get that type of response or welcome home that recent veterans have received on their way back, which was a good thing. And so we wanted to give Vietnam veterans a chance to share their thoughts and their experiences on the war. We didn't want an exhibit that focused on the war itself, like many other exhibits have done. We didn't want an exhibit that talked about the causes and the politics behind it and maps and charts and military operations, campaigns. We wanted this to be strictly about the veterans themselves, those Virginians that served in the Vietnam War. And so it was a very simple idea, but it really caught its own legs and its own momentum when we put out an invitation to veterans to submit photographs of themselves serving in Vietnam. And that was, again, a very simple idea, but had a wonderful response. We had over 1,000 photos submitted from around the state. And from those photographs, we selected 50 veterans from different parts of the state, different backgrounds, different branches of the military, and then sat down with them in different locations throughout the state and took professional photographs of them today because we wanted to show then and now and how they themselves have grown over the past 50 years. But perhaps more importantly, talk to them about their thoughts on Vietnam. And it wasn't a very structured interview at all. It was very open-ended. The questions we asked were very general, and we let the veterans just kind of fill in the blanks however they wanted to. Because I had the sense going into it, and I think I was proven correct, that Vietnam veterans have a lot of different opinions on things, and they don't think all the same about their experience, and they experience different things in the war. And so we just let them tell us what they thought and what they experienced without structuring questions too much, and we took those interviews and then filled in some information for people to see here when they see their portraits, and we also included video clips from those interviews in the QR codes located here in each veteran profile, so they can see and hear that veteran share some of their story. And again, it's a simple concept. It's not a very elaborate, I wouldn't say, or complicated exhibit, and yet I think it's a very powerful one, and it kind of does what we wanted it to do, and that's give the Vietnam veteran a chance to share their thoughts and feelings on what they experienced. Mr. Brown had a wonderful, the reason I loved Mr. Brown's story and the video that we included with it was he had so much humor to the story, and that's perhaps one thing that maybe people don't expect to hear when you're saying, well, I'm going to talk to some Vietnam veterans about their experiences in Vietnam. A lot of people might expect that that's going to be a pretty somber, discussion. It's going to be pretty muted or something like that. Lots of humor in some of these stories, and lots of crazy stories, and Mr. Brown definitely has a lot of interesting vignettes and stories to share. And my favorite is one we included in the video clip is him talking about why he wanted to become a Marine in the first place. And he talks about just hanging out on the street corner with his buddies, and he saw this Marine sharply dressed and very majestic in his Marine Corps uniform, was walking by, and a couple of sailors hanging out at the bar came out and tried to mess with this Marine and fight him, and this Marine just made short work of them, flipped them over a few times, and then put his hat back on and crisply walked away. And he's like, oh my goodness, I need to be one of those guys. Across the board, the veterans were thankful to be involved in this exhibit. They felt like it's a very worthwhile endeavor, a very worthwhile project, and they were happy to see it come to fruition. And again, across the board, all the family members are very proud of their veteran. And that definitely was a common denominator for everything. The families are proud of those that have served. Those that have served are proud of this country, even though they have different opinions on the war itself, you know, and the need for it or the necessity for it or how it played out. They are all very proud Americans, down to the very last one, even though they traveled different paths before and since. We had a wonderful photographer and videographer involved in this. Laura Hatcher is a Navy veteran who's also a professional photographer based in Northern Virginia. And somebody, a mutual friend, put me in touch with her. And once I saw her portraits, I was like, wow, this would be great to get her involved. Because I knew that in order for this exhibit to be effective, the portraits had to be really good. You couldn't have substandard portraits and still have the same impact. So I was hoping to get really good portraits. And in order to get those really good portraits, I knew the photographer would have to be able to connect with the veterans. And so her being a veteran herself, I knew that that was probably going to, lead that, but I just didn't, understand how good she was going to be, and she was fantastic. And she put us in touch with Pamela, a videographer, who, again, I wasn't really sure how we were going to incorporate videography into this too much, because I initially intended our interviews to just be audio. I was just going to capture the interviews on audio, but Pamela offered to record each of the interviews on video, and those turned out absolutely fantastic. I knew that, this is something that people are going to want to see. They're not just going to want to hear the videos, they're going to want to see it. And part of that video capture was Pamela was able to create a behind-the-scenes video, which we like to include, because when people come see our exhibits, a lot of them wonder, how did all of this come about? How did you put this together? So we put together a short 7 or 8 minute film that kind of explains the idea behind the exhibit, our thought process and putting it together, and how we sat down with the veterans and what they had to say. And so it's a nice complement to the exhibit itself, and add a little bit of color and again, some of that engagement and personal touch. I'm the son of a Vietnam veteran, and my father spent 2 tours in Vietnam. And growing up, I noticed that he didn't seem to talk about it very much, and I just assumed that he didn't have much to say because he didn't openly offer it. I found out later in life that with this set of veterans in particular, you need to ask them specifically to share their thoughts and feelings on Vietnam. And I believe that's a reflection of the reception they received when they came back from Vietnam, is that no one wanted to talk about it. They were intentionally ignored in a lot of aspects, and the conversation itself was intentionally dismissed by whether it was family members, friends, or the general public, because Vietnam was an uncomfortable issue at the time, both politically and socially. And so they've just carried that with them for 50 years, this notion that, well, nobody wants to hear about it, nobody really wants to hear my story. But when you ask them specifically, could you tell us a little bit about Vietnam, many of them are more than willing to open up and say, well, since you asked, yes, I'll talk about it.
Has your dad seen the exhibit?
He has. He came to the opening night and he saw the exhibit, and I think he was more interested in the other stories on the wall than his own, particularly because he's pretty familiar with his own. But he was just really, like all the others, just pleased to kind of sit back and soak in the entirety of it and see the effort we took to really give the Vietnam veteran their time in the spotlight to say what they wanted to say. So he was pleased with it. This exhibit includes 50 veterans and 1 cat. Chris Naggs, who is a longtime volunteer here at the Virginia War Memorial, was also a Navy officer. In his earliest Navy life, he was a young sailor aboard the USS Fresno off the coast of Vietnam. And so he had that experience, but then he would go on to become a submarine officer and a submarine captain, and eventually the commander of the naval installation at Pearl Harbor, Naval Base Pearl Harbor. And so, but he's also a cat lover, and he's also works with SPCA and has sponsored or fostered or whatever a number of cats in his home. And so he brought a cat to his portrait. As I mentioned, my father's a Vietnam veteran. He turned 80 this year, and I knew that this was not an exhibit we wanted to wait 3 years, 5 years, of course not 10 years to do, because we wanted to have access to as many Vietnam veterans as we could. And they are entering a period in their life when they're in their 70s, in their 80s. And if we were to kick the can down the road and wait longer to do this exhibit, we wouldn't be doing justice to those veterans. We need to capture their stories, and we needed to do it now. So there's a real sense of urgency to learn from this Vietnam veteran generation and learn from them now. We can't wait another 5-10 years to try and learn from them. Have to do it now.